So thank you, Ben, for coming today to speak to me. So Ben is the Senior Employment Advisor at IAPT,
Yes.
and we met, didn't we, probably, was it like 2 or 3 years ago?
Yes.
At Mind,
Yes.
when you used to work there. So we both work in the mental health space, and Ben's kindly offered to talk about his experience with poor mental health at work, but also how that linked into homophobic behaviour.
Yeah.
So tell me about previous employment then. You know, obviously you have experienced a deterioration in your own mental health. What do you see as the cause of that in previous employment?
Okay. So yeah, I guess a little bit of background with that. So I hadn't ever really experienced any issues in my employment with regard to my sexuality.
Yeah.
Prior to being in my late 20s, now in my mid 30s.
Yeah.
So really kind of took me by surprise when I experienced that for the first time. Didn't quite know how to respond to it. So
Yeah.
my default, because I'm not an activist per se, but I like to make sure that I'm abreast of current affairs, especially when it comes to the LGBTQIA plus community. So my default was to go to the person who was responsible for the homophobia and try to educate them on perhaps how some of the things that they were saying could be perceived as offensive, how that was impacting on me.
Because was it comments said directly to you, or was it stuff said in your earshot?
So it was initially, so it's quite a progressive thing. Initially, it was things that were said around the subject matter of LGBT.
Yeah, in a derogatory way, or
in a derogatory way. So making references to celebrities, for example, who are from the gay community, and making really quite unkind marks about them. And that then progressed after a number of weeks and months into direct slurs that were directed at me.
Yeah. And how did that make you feel once? So obviously you've got the kind of the indirect stuff. That's still offensive. Yeah. Just because it's not said to you doesn't mean it's not offensive. And as we know, the Equality Act protects individuals because sexual orientation is a protected characteristic, and individuals who have a protected characteristic and suffer any humiliation or offensive behaviour, whether that's words or conduct, are protected under that legislation. But did you know that at the time?
I had a vague awareness, I suppose, of the fact that homophobia was regarded as illegal.
Yes, so that's more criminal, but not Equality Act.
But not so much the Equality Act. So didn't quite know in terms of the workplace what my rights were, what my employer should or shouldn't be doing to support me with that.
And so that kind of takes me on to my next question, which is why didn't you know about that? Was that to do with their communication? Was it just generally there isn't anything available online, or a bit of both? What was the reason for you not really knowing where you stood with that? I
mean, I suppose partly because perhaps it was something which I just hadn't encountered before. I hadn't really needed to educate myself on that. Not that I was ignorant to it, I was aware that homophobia happened, just that it hadn't happened to me. So I don't recall any real robust equality and diversity training at that time. Certainly nothing that I'd read in any policies or procedures that detailed how they had a step-by-step guide to support somebody who was going through bullying at all, let alone homophobia.
Yeah, so obviously from an employer's perspective, the onus is on them to deliver that training. It's not on you to find that. How did that make you feel that they weren't actually even training people on what was okay and what wasn't okay in the workplace? How did that feel when you were then subjected to this treatment?
Yeah, so I suppose, in hindsight, I was quite upset, that nothing had been put in place, that there was no robust policies or procedures there to protect me, to protect other people who might be in a similar situation, and left me feeling quite vulnerable, to be honest, in the workplace. So my concern, because I had gone off work for a couple of months after the homophobia started.
Was that because of the treatment, the impact?
Because of the treatment, because of what had happened, because of the things that were being said to me, the way in which I was being treated by the individual initially. So what I actually did was I approached my employer and I let them know eventually. So after trying to kind of take matters in my own hands and think that I could maybe try to educate this person and go around it, a reasonable way, that it became quite apparent that wasn't an option. So I did approach my employer, and my employer initially didn't do anything about it. So they they basically in a not an exact way, but or in a direct way, but told me that they didn't believe what I had brought to them, what I told them.
Often it's one word against another, isn't it?
Yes.
And that's definitely an issue when it comes to pursuing grievances and trying to justify what you're saying and corroborate it with evidence, because ultimately it's usually between one or two people, and they'll if there's more of them, they'll back each other up. So that makes it very difficult, which is again why it goes back to why it's important to put things in place such as training and robust policies and procedures as to what does happen if someone raises it. So not only do you not have the training, you don't have the support, but when you do raise it, they're then kind of not saying you're lying, but they're kind of saying, oh well we can't do anything because we don't really know whether it's true. And that leaves you in a place then of what?
So, so basically that way I felt incredibly isolated then, didn't really know where I could turn, what I could do, what I should do. Had never really needed to reach out for that kind of specific support before. So the first person who I felt was obvious to go to, because I was feeling very low, my mental health was really suffering, I was feeling stressed, I was having panic attacks, anxiety attacks, sleeping was really difficult for me. So my doctor was the go-to person. Doctor advised that I should take some time off work because of
and is that why you were signed off originally?
So that's why I was originally signed off.
And did you suffer with mental health prior to this?
So I have experienced mental health prior to this year. Nothing really to this degree though. I suppose a degree of anxiety has always been present. But nothing really to this degree.
So you noticed because of that treatment the significant impact on your mental health, and that resulted in you being off for how long?
So I was off for almost a year actually.
Wow.
So I was away from the workplace for almost a year initially. What I found out shortly after going off, being signed off sick by my doctor, is that Unison could help me. So I'd signed up to Unison when I very first started working for my former employer, and I learned that it was through a colleague actually that I should get in touch with them, or they suggested that I should get in touch with them to discuss the situation, which I did. And it was really around that point that I started to acquire more of the knowledge which just wasn't readily available for me.
I think it's really difficult when you are feeling isolated, you're feeling vulnerable because your mental health is deteriorating, and then your employer aren't supporting when you're raising it. You've got an uphill battle, haven't you, effectively? And that's often when people come to us to help. That's about how we helped with Mind, and people generally when they're suffering with their mental health do struggle to articulate how the employer could help them as well, because they actually feel like everything's against them. And I mean, I've been in that situation before, so I can completely empathise. But ultimately, you've been off for, a year? What did they do in that year to get you back to work?
So
anything.
So during that time, so I'd submitted a formal grievance about the, regarding the perpetrator. That grievance took a good few months for it to be looked into, and for an outcome to be months.
Wow.
When the outcome eventually was given to me, I was sent it via email, and that email told me that nothing was being upheld and I had to return to work.
Did they invite you to a meeting before that, or did they just investigate it?
I had been invited to a meeting prior to receiving the grievance outcome, so I had a face-to-face meeting, which was quite gruelling, as I remember. It kind of felt like I was doing something wrong.
As though you're being disciplined rather than grievance.
And that really impacted, more so on my mental health. It made me feel like I was less welcome to go back to the workplace. I felt like I was being punished because I had raised something that I was experiencing. So ahead of the outcome, I was invited to an outcome meeting, but I received an email with the conclusion to the outcome before that, which made I'm not too sure if I would have felt any better having heard it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, but it just kind of left me sitting there over a weekend with that information, not really knowing what to do or
what it means, and what does that mean then? If they don't uphold it, you've just got to go back to work. They're not prepared to train people, give them a warning, because they don't technically believe you, is effectively what they're saying. So what did you do?
So at that point, I was in touch with my union rep,
Yes.
and I was advised to make an appeal. So one of the things which I had actually done, or started to do, and it was really probably in the latter couple of months of being targeted for being gay. I started to write down, I started to keep a diary, a log of all the things
really
that happened to me.
helpful to do, yeah.
And somebody had actually suggested that to me. It hadn't occurred to me. I'm not, naturally one to keep records of things. Things happen. And
a lot of people don't, and I think that's a really good point, especially when you're particularly unwell. If you write down the comments on the day that they happened, it can be used as evidence, but it also can help you prompt your memory as well.
Yeah. So I hadn't realised that. So I had this log there, which I told my union rep about. And that was then put forward to my employer as evidence. At that point, my union rep could see how much things had affected me, and suggested that regardless of whether or not I wanted to submit an appeal to the grievance, I should consider going ahead and taking my employer to a tribunal, because I had experienced homophobia. So I did submit the grievance appeal. At the same time as letting them know that I was going to
tribunal.
And then shortly afterwards, so it probably took them another couple of months, probably 2 to 3 months, and they then upheld my grievance in its entirety.
But was that? Do you think that was because they'd seen that you were serious about the claim as well? Do you think that was potentially why?
I absolutely think that played a part in it. I think partly the evidence which I produced to them by means of the notes which I
corroborating it.
Absolutely, but definitely I think a big factor in that was that they could see that I wasn't going to allow the perpetrator, or indeed them, silence me, or let that person get away with what they've done.
Because it could happen to someone else, and the thought of going through that again, I mean, you were probably just thinking, well, I know how hard this has been, so if this has to happen to somebody else, I think there is that obligation. But I think the difficulty we've got in the workplace is where employers aren't au fait with their equality policies, they don't engage in training, and when you do raise it, they don't really know what to do about it. Those three are quite catastrophic for the employee, because even if they'd have found in your favour, the damage was already done, and it makes it incredibly difficult for you to then go back and say, oh yeah, that's fine, I'll come back to work and carry on as normal, because that damage is lasting. So you said about you put a claim in. The claim presumably was for discrimination under the Equality Act.
Yes.
Yeah. And did you leave as well?
I didn't leave. No. One of the things that I was very determined to do was to return to the workplace. I'd invested quite a number of years at that particular or with that particular employer, and I wanted to go back. Partly because I really enjoyed my job.
And why should you leave? Just because you've been harassed at work?
Exactly. Partly because I'd asked them to make some changes to policies. That I wanted to be present. I wanted to see that actually happening, because I wanted to know that my friends, my colleagues were going to benefit from that going forward. That's
quite rare. A lot of people actually don't have the strength to go back in those situations. It's interesting that you say you still issued the claim, because a lot of people think they have to leave to issue a claim as well, and I think that's really interesting, is that actually sometimes you have to either go to ACAS and or issue a claim to get your employer to come to the table to actually listen to what you're saying, and it's a shame that it gets that far, but I think it's important that people understand that is still an option, and it's free to do that. You can do it online, can't you? I mean, you had the help of a union rep, but a lot of people don't. They're not in unions. So since then, obviously, you now work in the mental health sector, and you've obviously moved on from then. So how do you see this as a continuing problem in lots of workplaces for people that you're dealing with?
So I've spent, prior to this current role in IAT, I spent 3 years at Workplace Leeds at Leeds Mind, and had a caseload of clients who I worked with to try and find employment again. And certainly some of those clients that I worked with in that capacity had experienced various prejudice, but some specifically had experienced homophobia. So I suppose my my reason for exploring opportunities in this line of work was very much informed by my experiences. So I wanted to do something positive with what I'd experienced. Was really very fortunate in finding the opportunity workplace leads and being given that opportunity, and did go on to I hope support some people who were in similar situations to myself,
and kind of share that knowledge as well, because I think unless you've gone through something like that, it's incredibly difficult to compartmentalise some of the things that are happening. I mean, exactly with you, that's why we set Thrive up through poor mental health. That adversity pushes you to then support people in those situations because you can truly empathise with them. And I think that's really invaluable to a lot of people, and people tend to open up a little bit more because they actually see that you really do understand and that you're trying to help them. So in your current role at the moment then, where would you signpost people if they were in this situation? What would you do now if it was kind of, if you had to rework it as well? I suppose two questions. So
definitely, I mean I think the thing that I'm quite acutely aware of, having worked with such a diverse group of or with such a diverse array of clients, no two situations are the same. So people will present with what on the surface seems like very similar circumstances, but can be wholly different. So I suppose my first go-to would be to make sure that person feels that they're in complete control over what's happening at that time. So they're in control of all the decisions that are being made about the situation that they're in.
So it's like that you're not, when you say in control, it's that you're not telling them what to do, but you're giving them the options.
Exactly,
and
person-centred. So I would explore with them what services they would feel comfortable in reaching out to. So in Leeds, we're quite fortunate to have quite an array of services. Obviously, law firms like Thrive Law, services like Leeds Mind, like IACT, and like MESMAC as well. So MESMAC were an organisation, they're a local LGBT organisation who were very helpful for me during that time.
Brilliant.
I received some counselling through them, free counselling through them, specifically for the homophobia that I'd experienced. So I suppose...
so there are resources out there. So I think it's important that people know there's free support available. Even us as a law firm, we offer a level of free support, as you know, and I think it is important that people aren't scared to ask for help in those situations, because the sooner that people get help, the quicker that situation could be resolved. And it can be resolved. It might not be the way that they necessarily want to, and they may have to leave their job, but there's certainly ways in which you can get them out of that position, whether that's either issuing a claim, getting a settlement agreement, or something in between. And it just depends on that individual, and some people don't, like I said before, don't have the strength to fight it, and so they may just want to leave. But it's making sure people are doing things with options and are making informed decisions. So if you were to kind of have your time again in that situation, do you think you would have done anything differently?
So I thought about this.
Kind of knowing,
so
kind of knowing what you know now, and obviously you have such a breadth and depth of knowledge around mental health, about workplace practices, what employers should and shouldn't be doing. So if you were to have your time again and actually knowing all of that, would you have approached anything slightly differently?
So I think at a much earlier point, I would have started to document what was happening to me. So I would have started to write down all of the little instances, however trivial they may have seemed at the time. I would have made sure that I was making a note. I would have gone to my employer at an earlier point as well. Perhaps the outcome wouldn't have been any different, because it wasn't a year down the line, or however long it was down the line after I went to them with my concerns. But I think going to your employer at an earlier point can be really helpful, because it's out there. The onus is then on them. It's off you, and something productive could possibly be done at an earlier point.
I think that's a really important point, because if you can nip it in the bud early on, the employer are more likely to resolve it in your favour. If things drag on, there's the issue about witnesses, about memory loss, about reliability of evidence, and often the employers say, well, this has been going for so long, why haven't you said anything? The other reason I'd say that from a legal position is that you've got a 3-month time limit. So if you left something, if a comment was made and you didn't do anything for 6 months, you'd be out of time to bring a claim. Obviously with you had continuous things that were happening, so we can establish a continuing act, but it's really important that people recognise that whilst they might want to resolve it internally, they may need to issue a claim to protect their position, which is obviously what you were able to do. And there are, and I can can put links in the video clip to show people how to do that, and it's completely free to do. But I do think it's important that people realise those time limits, because often, especially when you're poorly, you know, you don't realise that actually you've got to do it within 3 months.
It's just not in your mind.
It's not in your mind at all. So if you are recording it, that's really, really helpful from an evidential point of view, but also from a memory perspective and the dates perspective. So I think that's really, really helpful from when things happened, and then if we're going to establish a continuing act, we can then look at, well, when did the first one and what gaps were between them, and who was involved as well. That's really important, if there were any witnesses. Often it's one word against another, which I appreciate is difficult.
Very difficult. I think one of the other things that I would maybe do if I did have my time again and was able to go back to that situation with the knowledge that I have now, I'd want to try to reassure my employer that my intention was only ever really to be able to sustain the employment that I had. You know, that I wanted them to listen. I wanted them to do something positive to help me during that time. I didn't feel like that was ever really happening until it was too late.
Did you think that? Did you feel as though they were being defensive when you submitted that grievance?
Very much so. That put me in quite an isolated position, really. And I'd gone to them hoping that I could trust them with the really upsetting information that I detailed, and hope that they would listen to me as a valued member of of employment, or valued member of the company. I would have really hoped that they would have listened to that and dealt with it differently.
So how do you think you could have done that though? Because obviously you have put a grievance in. Do you think you could perhaps put what your preferred outcome was at the end of that grievance, as in, you know, I want to stay employed, these are the things I need to change, and perhaps make suggestions? Well, I mean, I get that it's not the employee's job to do that, but I do think it's helpful to get a better response and reaction to that. So do you think that would have helped?
Definitely. Had I been asked what would I like to happen
as a result of this grievance?
Absolutely. That would have perhaps helped.
Because I think often what can happen is employers say, well, I've got to pick one of them, and actually it wasn't really about taking sides. It was about identifying a clear problem and looking how we can prevent that from happening again, and putting things in place. So actually, this employer could have taken it as a positive, but they became defensive. And in my experience as a lawyer, that tends to be the way that things go. And it's really disappointing, because actually the whole point of the grievance process is there so that employees can air any issues.
Absolutely.
And it's supposed to be there to assist them. But in my experience, whenever employees put in a grievance, employers are often defensive, and employees often go on long-term sick. And then once you're on long-term sick, especially with mental ill health, it's very difficult to come back to work and sustain that employment to the level that you were before. So I think that's a really good point to say, actually, these are the things that I would like to change. It's not that I want him to be sacked or this to happen, it's that I want them educating, and I want the policies and the training to be put in place, which is required under the Equality Act anyway. So you're only reminding them of their legal obligations, but I think it's a really good point that employers can learn from, of kind of how not to do it.
Absolutely, I think one of the other things as well, because when I did eventually return, I did have a phased return. Things did seem different actually when I had returned.
When you say seem different, in terms of the way people treated you, or?
So there was a few different things that were going on. So there were changes to policies which were happening, which I was kind of being briefly informed about. So not in a direct way, but I was finding out things perhaps through my line manager at the time, and I was aware that some changes were afoot. I felt that perhaps some of the people who I'd worked with, some of my colleagues, in particular my line manager, was maybe perhaps a little bit more wary of me, maybe, or just didn't perhaps know how perhaps to approach me. And I feel that maybe part of that, and I wouldn't want to assume, but perhaps part of that was because I'd experienced mental health issues during that period, and that again, going back to work, it made it quite difficult, made me feel quite lonely, I suppose.
But you already feel isolated because you've been out of work for so long, and it's that absence is really difficult to then replace.
Yeah.
So you already feel isolated, and you've been bullied and harassed, and you've had experienced mental health during that period of time, and that has a lasting effect. And I think managers don't really know how to deal with that, do they?
No,
not in most companies.
There are some fantastic managers out there who do a lot for the staff in terms of mental health. They've perhaps got a mental health first aider in the workplace, which is essential in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that perhaps wasn't the case where, you know, in that situation.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it comes down to, I mean, from what, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it comes down to education and training and making it clear what is and what isn't okay in the workplace, and what the consequences will be if anyone breaches those policies. And I'm not saying, you know, you have to follow things by the letter, but there's some things which are clearly not okay, and then there are some things which are not okay which amount to a criminal offence and a breach of the Equality Act, and the employer still, even though that it amounts to both of those things, they don't actually act on it. I think that's where the employer could be liable of a significant claim, because if you were to leave and resign and say, well, it's constructive dismissal because I was discriminated against, you did nothing about it, and then when I did come back, I was made to feel isolated, or often segregated is the word that people use, then that could result in a constructive dismissal claim, because you'd be effectively forced to leave. So that can be quite an expensive and protracted claim to bring in the tribunal, which obviously people, especially if they've been particularly unwell, don't really want to go down that road. However, if someone has to leave and they have no choice, then that's a real risk to the business, because the value of that could be significant, and often is in excess of 12 months' salary. So from an employer's perspective, it kind of pays to invest in this stuff.
Absolutely.
But also, I think now we're moving forward in the world where actually people coming into the workplace are looking for things like, well, what is your diversity and inclusion policy? What training do you provide? What support do you do? You know, what are you doing in all these different areas? Not just around sexual orientation, but disability, like you've just alluded to. And I think it is really important that employers look at the wider picture and make sure they treat all of these different protected characteristics and minorities as important in the workplace, because what they're effectively doing is losing key skilled people by not providing a safe place for them to work.
Absolutely.
So, and that's really important. I think there's a lot more happening in some workplaces, but I think some workplaces are falling really far behind. And so from your perspective, in moving forward, if someone was in this position, where would you direct them to go? I mean, you obviously mentioned so
a few of the
mental health stuff, but is there
absolutely.
anything specific in Leeds that you think in terms of a community that can support people?
With regard to LGBT or just in
general?
general?
I think so. LGBT.
So we do. There are a few different gatherings, or a few different groups of people that perhaps organisations or charities that people could be signposted onto. So MESMAC being one of them. Leeds City Council also has an LGBT hub, which was set up a couple of years ago, and I understand that they do quite a lot of networking throughout Leeds. So they look at any gaps or areas within the LGBT community which perhaps aren't catered for, so in particular older LGBT people as well, and making sure there is community space, there is provisions out there for people to access those things. So I think raising more awareness in
the city,
absolutely, about those provisions is really essential. I mean, it's what it's all about, isn't it? We're all networking, we're all sharing experiences and knowledge.